Now, the rest of the story. He had been a local hero, an admired city official, Cleveland's director of public safety, no less. But Rebecca McFarland found him homeless, languishing among parked cars and literally in a cardboard box. How could this have happened, Rebecca wanted to know. What tragedy could have toppled this once respected man to such lowly anonymity? He did not answer. We will answer for him. Before the Department of Public Safety hired him, Cleveland youth gangs had taken over the streets. Burglaries were on the rise, and vandalism, of course, turf wars. But then along comes this soft-spoken, unassuming fellow who hates guns. He won't even carry a gun. And he's walking alone and unprotected in a sweatshirt and casual slacks through the riot-torn Trenton district, simply talking to young thugs. I wonder they don't kill him, but he listens to them. And they listen to him. He asks what are their interests, and they answer sports. He says he'll find them all of the recreational facilities they want, but the deal is they have to behave themselves, police their own. Well, they say okay. And pretty soon local schools and churches and merchants and off-duty cops and firemen and even the Boy Scouts get involved. Coddling punks, the critics called it at first. But what do you know? The juvenile crime rate is falling like a bushel of brass knuckles, and more victories follow. The exposure of union shakedowns, a major push for traffic safety resulting in a 40% decrease in fatalities. Oh, there are some failures as time goes on, but it's the personal ones that echo loudest in the street and in the newspapers. A succession of ill-fated marriages, then that lousy, icy April night when the public safety director, drinking and driving, sends another motorist to the hospital. Hit and run, the headlines call it, and the people demand his resignation, and they get it. The downhill slide is a steep one after that. Bungled business deals and bankruptcy, and before his eyes, his life has dissolved into an oblivion of alcoholism, destitution, illness, and shame. And who arrives on the scene? But a 44-year-old Cleveland librarian named Rebecca McFarland, and she is the one who finds him literally in a cardboard box, and she takes pity and takes it upon herself to restore some measure of his dignity by arranging a proper burial. You see, the city's once celebrated director of public safety had died drunk and in debt and forgotten. 40 years previous, age 54, even his ashes were neglected, casually stashed in a box in his daughter-in-law's garage. But now there's a handsome monument in Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery, thanks to Rebecca. For in 1997, in a solemn ceremony, she scattered those once abandoned ashes in a peaceful lagoon nearby. But once upon a crime, there was an official of the Treasury Department, Prohibition Bureau, who would have given anything to become an agent of the FBI, yet who, rejected as such, moved to Cleveland instead. You've always thought of him as the man who put away Al Capone, the number one untouchable. But now you've met the unlovable Eliot Ness. Now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. It's hard to imagine Eliot Ness, the leader of the Untouchables, fading into obscurity. When you think of Eliot Ness or the Untouchables, what picture comes to mind? Before I began researching this episode, I could not have picked Eliot Ness's picture from a photo lineup. I hate to admit that the image that comes to mind for me is that of, well, Kevin Costner's portrayal of Eliot Ness in the 1987 film The Untouchables. That's one of my personal favorites. How could you go wrong with a true crime film with Kevin Costner, Charles Martin Smith, Andy Garcia, and Sean Connery as the good guys trying to outwit and outgun Robert De Niro as Al Capone? For others, it may be of Robert Stack's portrayal of Eliot Ness in the television drama The Untouchables. Now that one ran from 1959 to 1963 on ABC, produced by Desilu Productions. Desilu Productions was co-owned by Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. You know, I Love Lucy. Most of us know Eliot Ness through Hollywood, but that's a major problem because those productions were made not as documentaries, but as entertainment films. These are fictionalized accounts loosely based on Eliot Ness's career, but most of us accept them, or at least parts of them, as fact. It's not our fault. Hollywood has gotten good at making us believe what they want us to believe. Because I live near the spot where law enforcement officers killed Bonnie and Clyde in that famous ambush, I've spent years researching the lives and crimes of Bonnie and Clyde, as well as the lives and careers of the officers. During one conversation, a fellow told me he knew all about Bonnie and Clyde because he had seen the movie numerous times. And I'm sure it's the same with Kevin Costner film or the Robert Stack television show. But what do we really know about Eliot Ness? Eliot Ness was born in 1903 in Chicago, Illinois, to Norwegian immigrants. His parents operated a bakery. Eliot graduated from Christian Finger High School in Chicago and earned political science and business administration degrees from the University of Chicago. After college, he worked as a credit investigator in the Chicago area for the Retail Credit Company of Atlanta, Georgia. In the following year, 1926, Eliot's brother-in-law, an agent of the Bureau of Investigation, convinced him to join the U.S. Treasury Department, where he worked along the Bureau of Prohibition in Chicago. In 1930, Prohibition agents increased their efforts to take down notorious gangster Al Capone. Al Capone had the sinister nickname Scarface, which came about following an incident in New York City. Early in his criminal career, Al, a member of the 5 Points Gang, insulted a woman while working security at the door of a Coney Island dance hall and saloon. In retaliation, Frank Galluccio, the woman's brother, slashed Al's face 3 times with a knife or straight razor. The fight left Al with long scars on the left side of his face. Al hated the nickname and avoided having the left side of his face appear in photographs. A man could disappear for just calling Al Scarface to his face. His closest friends called Al Snorky, which was a term for a sharp-dressed man. Now this nickname he liked. In 1919, Al left New York City for Chicago to work as an enforcer for crime boss Big Jim Colosimo. In 1925, following numerous murders, Al himself became the crime boss of Chicago. Agents for the Bureau of Internal Revenue had been investigating Al along with other members of organized crime and were putting together a case for income tax evasion, but it was slow work. President Herbert Hoover decided to send a small team of Prohibition agents to target Al's illegal breweries and supply routes while building a case against Al and his men for conspiracy to violate the National Prohibition Act. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, the Chicago prosecutor in charge of building the case against Al, chose Eliot Ness to create and lead the small group of Prohibition agents. Corruption among Chicago's law enforcement agents was expected. Eliot finally decided on 6 agents whom he considered reliable, incorruptible, the untouchables. In March 1931, based largely on information gathered through wiretapping, Eliot and his men began targeting Al's illegal stills and breweries. Within months, they destroyed bootlegging operations worth millions of dollars to Al. In the following year, Al had a member of his gang try to bribe Eliot with a weekly cash payment of $2,000. Now, adjusted for inflation, that would be just over $40,000 a week in today's money. Could you turn a blind eye for $40,000 cash per week? Eliot Ness refused the offer. In June of that year, Al was indicted on 5,000 violations of the National Prohibition Act. However, Al was tried on a tax evasion case. In October 1931, Al was convicted of just 3 of 22 counts of income tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. Following a failed appeal, Al began serving his sentence on May 3, 1932. On that day, Eliot Ness was among the federal agents who transported Al to prison. It was the only time Eliot Ness and Al Capone met, despite what you've seen in the movie. Following the end of Prohibition in 1933, Elliott was assigned as an alcohol tax agent in the Moonshine Mountains of Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. In 1934, he was transferred to Cleveland. It was there, as Mr. Harvey explained, that Elliott worked as Cleveland's safety director. Then he participated in the investigation of the Cleveland torso murderer. Locals sometimes refer to the serial killer as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run because the dismembered bodies of 13 known victims and the disposal of their body parts in the impoverished neighborhood of Kingsbury Run in the mid and late 1930s. There may have been more than 20 murders done by the serial killer. 2 of the victims were found within view of Elliott's office window. Was the killer taunting Elliott, you think? From there, Elliott's career path changed drastically. In 1942, Elliott moved to Washington, D.C., where he worked to rid the community surrounding military bases, remember this is during World War II, of prostitution. Venereal diseases had become a serious medical issue which cost the government a lot of money. 2 years later, he became chairman of a security company based in Ohio. Things are looking good. In 1947, he even ran for mayor of Cleveland, Ohio against incumbent Thomas A. Burke. When the votes were counted, Elliott received just under 86,000 votes, which was impressive. But his opponent, Thomas Burke, received over 168,000 votes. Following his unsuccessful campaign for mayor, Elliott's career declined. He worked as a bookstore clerk for a while, then as a wholesaler. In 1956, Elliott moved to Pennsylvania, where he began working as a partner in a startup company which claimed to have created a new method for watermarking documents to prevent counterfeiting. But the company fell apart when one of Elliott's partners revealed that the company had misrepresented the watermarking process. They didn't have a product. Without the product, the company failed and Elliott lost his investment in the company. On May 16, 1957, 54-year-old Elliott Ness died of a heart attack at his home in Pennsylvania. He died in impoverished obscurity. His family was unable to afford the cost of his burial. His estate showed a debt of over $8,000. 2 years after his death, Elliott Ness was resurrected, well, from obscurity anyway, by the TV series The Untouchables starring Robert Stack. In 1987, Elliott Ness was further cemented as a law enforcement hero in the film The Untouchables starring Kevin Costner. As Mr. Harvey explained, Ness's body was cremated and his ashes remained with his family for 4 decades. In 1997, more than 300 people watched as police bagpipers from Cleveland and Chicago played Going Home in Amazing Grace. A police honor guard fired 3 sharp volleys, 2 helicopters did flyby salutes, and his ashes and the ashes of his 3rd wife and son were scattered on the Wade Chapel Lake in Lakeview Cemetery. A monument listing his accomplishments is a popular spot in the cemetery. Now, earlier I derided Hollywood for its lack of historical accuracy, but in Elliott Ness's case, he would have been largely forgotten otherwise. But maybe now when we think of Elliott Ness, we'll picture him not as a movie star, but as the man he really was. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.